an original.
From Story Studio Network.
I want you to think about this. Canadian forestry has a role to play in saving the planet.
Absolutely. The answer is yes.
Welcome to this Story Studio Network podcast series. I'm Dave Trafford. In this series, Aaron Trafford and I will explore a number of ideas that hinge on the notion of Canadian forestry helping to save the world.
There's no path to a net zero carbon economy without the forest sector and forest products, full stop.
We'll talk about how and why Canadian forests have the ability to shift the climate crisis and the economy to build a better future.
There is no machine and no process known to man better than a tree that's sequestering carbon.
We'll explore innovations in forest management that drive a green economy and directly address the climate issue.
We have a significant amount of the world's forest land. With that privilege comes the responsibility of taking care of it.
So welcome in to this special series produced for Forestry for the Future.
I hope you're enjoying this Forestry for the Future podcast series. If it's the first time you've listened, you really should go back and put an ear on the first 2 episodes. But FYI, we've already spent some time talking about the leading role Canada's forest industry has taken in developing, promoting, and managing sustainable forests.
Yeah, it really is worth your time to go back and have a listen to those first 2 episodes if you haven't done so already, because we've learned that forest sustainability depends on a pretty sophisticated modeling system. We're talking about projecting 100, maybe 200 years into the future just to make sure that we and our kids and our grandkids and maybe even their kids have healthy, resilient forests. And it's become somewhat more complex, of course, in the face of the climate crisis.
In fact, we're learning we cannot achieve net zero carbon goals without our forestry sector. We put that entire question to Jennifer Tallman.
Do we get to net zero without the forestry sector participating?
No.
Jennifer's a forester in Timmins, Ontario.
I'm the chief forester for Ontario with Interfor.
Interfor has sawmills in Ontario, in Quebec. They manage forests up in northeastern Ontario.
That is all public Crown land. And we are given the license to manage the forest from start to finish. So we write the forest management plans. It's a 10-year forest management plan. We implement it, and that includes everything from how are you going to build roads, go do a harvest, have all of the protections in place and renew the forest afterwards. And then we have the benefit of using the wood harvested off of those forests in our sawmills to produce lumber.
Now, it's important to note that Interfor's licenses are specifically called Sustainable Forestry Licenses. If you hadn't had a chance to listen to episode 2, you really got to go back because Jennifer does such a great job. She walks us through the operational logistics necessary to execute and implement these long-term generational forest management plans.
And Jennifer says that long-term plan, the management and renewal of forests, is literally a force of nature that we need to fight climate change.
Looking at the Canadian context and how much of our country is covered by forest and the ability of those forests to absorb carbon, produce oxygen, I don't know how you get to it without the active involvement of the forest sector. Forests are such a part of the solution. Whether it's in the products, like if you take a lumber product, you've just stored carbon for many years, however long that piece of furniture is going to hang around, or the wood that is part of your house it has the ability to store carbon for that long. And then how you're managing the forest when you're planting new trees, they have they have almost all of their cycle there that they're going to be absorbing carbon and emitting oxygen. I don't see how you do it without the contribution of forests.
So that brings us to the next phase in this exploration. We can't have sustainable forests unless we have a firm grasp and understanding of the life cycle of the forest.
And we'll learn the life cycle of a forest extends well beyond its growing years. Kind of reminds me of Shel Silverstein's 1973 kids book. Remember that book, The Giving Tree?
Once there was a tree, and she loved a little boy. And every day the boy would come, and he would gather her leaves.
Tells the story of a little boy who plays around in and with a tree. And we see the little boy and the tree's relationship grow as they get older.
Then one day the boy came to the tree, and the tree said, "Come, boy, come and climb up my trunk and swing from my branches and eat apples and play in my shade and be happy." "I am too big to climb and play," said the boy. "I want to buy things and have fun. I want some money. Can you give me some money?" "I'm sorry," said the tree, "but I have no money. I have only leaves and apples. Take my apples, boy, and sell them in the city. Then you will have money and you will be happy."
Now, at the heart of the story, of course, is the tree's desire to make her little friend happy. It's quite literally a life cycle story that ends with the tree being cut down and reduced to a stump. And the little boy is now an elderly man.
"I don't need very much now," said the boy. "Just a quiet place to sit and rest."
Now, the tree is sad because she has nothing to offer the boy to make him happy.
"I wish that I could give you something, but I have nothing left. I am just an old stump."
Except the stump of the tree just happens to be what the boy needs now.
"Well, an old stump is good for sitting and resting. Come, boy, sit down and rest." And the boy did, and the tree was happy.
It's a lovely story, but the bittersweet ending leaves us with the idea that once a tree is cut down, once it's gone for good. It's just not true.
And that idea of once a tree is gone, it's gone for good is a common chorus we're hearing, particularly when it comes to the old growth forests. The narrative suggesting, cutting down old growth is bad for the environment, and it's a mismanagement of these precious natural resources.
And it's easy to see how that argument can resonate. I mean, it's emotional, and it comes from a conservationist perspective.
And professional foresters we've talked to actually fully appreciate the sentiment, but it's more sentimental than scientific.
My name is Lacey Rose, and I'm the county forester for the County of Renfrew in Ontario.
Lacey Rose will tell you a robust forest management plan takes diversity into account, though. Diversity in species and diversity in the age of the forest.
I think it's important to recognize that all ages and life stages of trees and forests are important. So although old forests are important and old trees are important, young forests are also important.
That balance is at the heart of the forest's life cycle. And Lacey extends that definition even further of life cycle to the animals, the insects, the plants, the fish that all rely on a healthy forest for food and shelter.
And there are certain species of wildlife that require young forests to complete their life functions. So some species of birds require open, young forest areas. Ungulates like deer and moose require young trees to browse on. Beavers require young forest within a close vicinity of wetlands to collect food, or they risk being eaten by wolves going further than that. So all of these things are natural processes, and as forest managers, it's our responsibility to make sure that all forest types and ages are represented on the landscape, to make sure that those other users of forests, like wildlife, can complete their life functions.
So we've learned the life cycle of the forest certainly depends on science-based research and decades-long planning. It not only ensures resilient forests, it creates and provides food and shelter for the forest life.
But we literally need to get to the root of the issue here. And of course, that starts with the seed needed to grow a healthy tree.
My name is Kerry McLaven. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Forest Gene Conservation Association.
Kerry McLaven leads a group that oversees and coordinates the collection and the harvesting of seeds so that foresters have the access to the right kind of tree seed when and where it's needed in order to ensure we have those healthy, sustainable forests.
We are a nonprofit based in Ontario. We are people that advise the foresters and forest managers and practitioners about how to adapt to a changing climate, how to deal and manage tree seed, how to collect seed. And also we work with species at risk. So we try to help recover species that are listed as a species at risk. And those species that potentially could become at risk in the near future.
We had a pretty wide-ranging discussion with Kerry about the life cycle of our Canadian forests, and she starts off by making it very clear our forests are in good hands.
We have some of the most sustainable forestry operations in the world. And I hope you've heard, I'm sure you've heard that from your other interviewees, but you know, we are trying to replicate things that would happen in nature. That's really what drives the Canadian forestry operations here. And so all of these things, as humans, we've impeded their natural processes over the years and how they're adapted to fire and how they have regular environmental stresses that impede on them. They have insects and infestations and all these things would happen normally. But as humans, we've suppressed those things by different activities. And so as the years have gone on, we've learned and we've adapted. And so now a lot and most of forestry practices are focused on emulating nature. And so you know, the other part of it is that, I mean, we're going to see a lot of old trees in a lot of different areas. And in some areas of Canada, there are no old trees anymore. They don't exist anymore. But the DNA in trees have existed for millennia. So even a little tree has old genetics beyond humans that it carries with them. And so it's another important piece. It's a totally different level than that, seeing that big old tree. You know, trees still have that old data that they carry with them and carry forward. So there's so many levels to forestry, but everyone emphasizes the focus on some of those older, larger trees. But there is still a lot of old history in forests that exist, even in young forests.
Kerry, can I ask you, like, this is such a great point to ask this question. So the episode that we're crafting with you and these other voices, we're exploring this myth of once a tree is gone, it's gone. So you kind of just opened that door. I'm curious to hear more about the DNA stuff. But one of the things that we've brought into the concept is that book, The Giving Tree, you know, for kids. And my daughter just turned 6 on the weekend. We went through Hurricane Fiona, a month ago, 5 weeks ago. And I experienced it firsthand through her when our front lawn and our backyard, we lost all our trees. And the one in the front was this beautiful, beautiful tree. We always called it a she. Anyway, she didn't fall down, but the root system got all messed up. The whole elevation changed on the front yard. We ended up having to cut it down because it was going to come on the power lines, fall on the house, fall on the cars. So we had it cut down. She went to school and then my husband picked her up and she saw the tree was gone and she physically had like this visceral reaction to seeing the stump. And I thought, oh, like that's what she had, this connection to the tree. She couldn't understand it needed to come down. She's so young. And then, so there was just a lot happening there, the emotion of the tree. But then it was that last page of The Giving Tree where the little boy is sitting on the stump and thinking, thank you for all that you've given me. So I'm saying all of this and all I'm going to ask you to do is comment on what you think I just told you. There's no question there. Other than that, let's just unpack all of that from your perspective. Yeah.
That's great. Well, and like, not to go in the depth of DNA, but that's the great thing about trees is they reproduce and they reproduce regularly. How regularly, it depends by species, but they do that. They continue to give. So in some years where they don't have the resources to give, they don't give. But in the years that they do, they do. And so when they do, their seeds go, and they've adapted to producing so many seeds beyond, because they know there's squirrels and there's wind and there's everything else that's supposed to eat them and be fulfilled and contribute to that overall forest. But they know what they're doing. And so really, what we do want to make sure is that there are enough trees out there. Like, we can't just cut them all and just think they're going to come back. We do need to make sure we manage them sustainably so that there is that population that can reproduce healthily and continue to contribute. But yeah, it's just, that whole ending of life thing from a tree, and even from a human perspective, there's so much more that we carry forward beyond our life, and the same thing goes with the trees. And that's why I think seed is the reason, that seed is a solution, because it really is. That's the next generation that gets carried forward, and all that information goes with it.
Tell me more about that phrase you just said, that the trees know what they're doing.
Absolutely. It's something I think we as humans take for granted all the time, that we can control everything to do with the tree, but we can't. Like I said, every species has a different type of seed. They've evolved that way so that they don't mix between species. Their pollen is different. The timing of their pollination is different. When they produce flowers, when they produce seeds, the type of seed, the proteins they have in them, it's all different. So they've adapted to their situation, and they continue to propagate that way. And so for us as humans, the best thing we can do, like forest management, is emulate nature. When are they producing seeds? When is the best time to collect it? When's the best time to sow it? How do we sow it? And where do we sow it? Like, if we follow the things, if we take or observe how the trees are doing these things, and we continue to do that, we're only helping the cause. We're not going to impede the cause. And especially in areas where we have fragmented the forest so much. In Southern Ontario, it's a big spot where we've cut lots of trees. We've cleared a lot for other land use purposes. And so the forests don't have that connectivity. So how can we emulate what would naturally happen with those forests in absence of that connected forest? And that's how we're going to have success.
What are some of those solutions? How do you go about connecting a disconnected forest?
Yeah, one is tree planting. Tree planting in areas where trees don't exist, or long corridors, between forests, making current forests bigger, so augmenting what's there. And something that we try to help practitioners do is moving seed. So because we have climate change, and we know our climate has already changed and is changing, we're thinking about moving seed a little bit of a distance in the right direction. But also knowing that these trees would have naturally migrated with every blue jay fly, with every squirrel jumping, they would have naturally done that. But when you have a big, 12-lane highway in between, those things might not naturally happen. And so we will start to facilitate that through tree planting and that sort of thing. So there's all different ways. It just depends on where you're located.
We talked to Lacey Rose, and she was talking about how, given the changing temperatures, we're starting to see warmer temperatures moving further north. And so, for example, she's got her eye on jack pine, where we have jack pine stands. You won't be able to plant jack pine there anymore, but it's going to be just as important to make sure we have the jack pine seed to get it to where it's going to be crucial. How far out can you do that modeling to be able to say, for the purposes of that forest management, anticipating as you can the climate change, and then the long-term health and well-being of a jack pine forest? You don't want to necessarily be planting in something that's not going to be there 10 years from now.
Yeah, and this is a big challenging problem for foresters, because there's risks involved, and they're making a lot of decisions based on information that is modeling and models, because we don't exactly know how things will happen. A lot of the models that we work with, and we work with people like Lacey with, are informed by Natural Resources Canada's work, how they've studied the climate changing up until this point, and how the models are going to predict it to change. You can look into 2100 for example, and see that far out. The farther out you go, the less accurate the data may be. We don't know that for sure, but that's likely the case. Is the further out you go, the less accurate. But it's still a tool in a forester's toolbox to give them knowledge to make decisions that's going to be best for their forest. So a lot of the climate models are based on how much emissions we're going to emit. So it's based on, are we going to stop right now emitting, and then what does that look like? Or are we going to continue to emit business as usual? And then that's a totally different scenario that we're going to see. But again, it's just a piece of information, and they can only do what they can with their resources. But certainly a lot of people, a lot of foresters are starting to ask these questions and trying to figure out how can they adapt to the significant changes in climate that we're expecting to be experiencing.
If the foresters are asking that question, I'm wondering, Kerry, is there a way that we can, and forgive me because this is going to be a bit of an on the nose question, but how do we make everybody else care as much? Like, what is the general public, besides the people who are like, out in BC chaining themselves to old growth forests? Let's leave them out of the equation. How do we make people like me, like late 30s, 2 kids, busy, suburban, how do we make me care about all of this science that clearly is capable of moving us in the right direction?
Yeah. Really good question. I think one thing generally is to increase the value and the awareness of our forests. And so I think for a lot of people that don't live and work and spend time around forests, that's something that we can definitely do easily. It's just improve their understanding, the importance and the connections that we have to the forest and our need for healthy forests. That's the very foundation of it. After that point, the climate change piece, climate change is a hard thing for people to understand generally, but then how do you do something about it? Like the practitioners are trying to figure out how to do things about it in an informed way. And so I don't expect the general public to kind of jump on that bandwagon at this point, but definitely valuing forests, valuing their presence, but also the fact that we as humans are affecting them. And so we as humans have to be a part of the solution. So we can't they're not just going to necessarily figure it out on themselves because we're changing the climate so much. So we have to be part of the solution, not just standing back and watching them do their thing when we're still impacting them so heavily.
I want you to respond to the idea that, we talk about the life cycle of the forest. And I don't think, back to Aaron's point about make me understand, make me care, that we fully appreciate that part of the life cycle of the forest and the healthy forest, the resilient forest, is actually a component of that is harvesting. But you and your team coming along very quickly and making sure we've got seeds to make up for that. But we only see the harvesting part of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you think about the whole life cycle, so a tree, comes from seed. It grows, hopefully it grows beyond the competition on that site. And then it gets to a point where it's starting to thrive and it grows its height. And then it gets to a point where it's producing seed again. So some species are adapted to some of those events, like we were talking about, like fire, like wind damage, other things that the seed, not always the seed, does it fall a certain way, or does it come out unless there's fire? There's different things that influence how a tree reproduces and that life cycle you're talking about. So in forest management, what we're trying to emulate is a condition that those seeds need and those trees need in their early years to grow. So in a jack pine forest, you would have fire that essentially wipes out everything on the ground. That's the condition that those seeds need. The fire has to open the cones, needs that. And then those seeds need that open, hot, dry, open conditions to germinate into a tree. And so, other species are the same thing. Black spruce, white spruce. I'm talking about Ontario right now. But same thing. They need those types of conditions to take root, shoot up quickly to take advantage of that site and then grow into their forest that they're they're used to doing. So in forestry, that's why you see things like clear cuts. And that's why in a different type of forest, you wouldn't see a clear cut. In a Great Lakes St. Lawrence, you would see selection harvest and different other types of harvest that would see pockets of trees dying, or groupings and that sort of thing, or individual trees. So it really is, our forestry operations here are adapted to the type of forest and what the natural conditions that they're used to with nature. So I guess, all that kind of does come back to the seed, because that is the condition that allows those seeds to grow and continue to thrive. Wildlife also take advantage of those younger tree conditions. When they can get into those areas, they have access to their trees they can munch on, and other species that come in there as well.
Is that what they call browsing when they talk about deer
browsing?
browsing?
Yeah, and like when you're trying to plant trees at a large scale, it's, you're trying to plant more than what the deer can eat and everyone can eat. So yeah.
Just to be clear, and when we talk about the forests that are growing naturally, we just don't have, here are the 50 acres of oak, here are another 50 acres of white pine, all standing together. These are mixed forests, right? I mean, we rarely have a completely coniferous or deciduous forest. So when we're making those calculations around harvest, that sounds like a tricky bit of business, because the maple may not be ready to harvest, but the pine may be. Is that fair?
Yeah. So what they do, here we go again with the use of models. So what they do is they observe, a natural stand and the conditions that it goes through and the stages it goes through. And this is something that's done over, 100 years plus. So they kind of model those conditions, and then how do we get this mix of forest to get to that natural condition it's used to? And so that modeling really helps drive the decision-making process of how that forest is managed to get to that point. So again, in Ontario, you identify different stands by the species mixture. And so then you treat them differently. So each, you might not have this large forested area that's all this one type of stand. You might have multiple different types. One's like a hemlock forest, and then one's a pine spruce. And so you manage them differently depending on how you would classify them. So yes, sugar maple may not be a primary species in that forest. It might be pine, whereas another one, oak and pine and some of the bigger hardwoods, would be the primary species. So it depends on that mixture.
Interesting to me to hear how the various elements of forest management are common across the country. But as Kerry pointed out, the plans are also specific to the regional character of any given forest. But who sets the standard for forest management plans? How do we ensure governments, the nonprofits, the private sector organizations involved in the forestry sector have a common language and understanding when it comes to sustainable forestry?
Well, let's meet the soft-spoken Jacob Handel.
My name is Jacob Handel. I'm a Senior Director for Indigenous Relations for SFI, which stands for Sustainable Forestry Initiative.
Tell me about the Sustainable Forestry Initiative. What is that?
The Sustainable Forestry Initiative is a certification organization that looks at creating sustainable forest within Canada, North America, the United States. It's a binational certification organization, and it brings a suite of opportunities and programs and to bear to ensure and move forward forest practices, forest management in a collaborative forest focused way that includes people, nature, and the forest.
So it sounds to me like the certification not only applies to the groups that are involved, i.e. a forestry company or someone that goes in to cut the timber, but it also applies to the nature of that forest itself in terms of its growth and makeup, right?
Yeah, you said it very well. Thank you for making that point for me. Exactly. I would say that's very much the case. And it trickles down to the average person as well. So, people often don't realize that their view makes a difference. So if they want to ensure that sustainable forests are managed in perpetuity, respectfully, in a good way, when they start demanding products that come from a sustainable forest, a certified forest, they're making their needs and interests known, and that's what actually happens. And that's where a certification organization like SFI and let's say a certified company, a forest company, complies with that wish, that interest, that societal need.
The one thing, again, going back 30 years where there wouldn't have been the emphasis that there is now is climate change. And I've talked to a number of foresters, for example, who look at forest management, obviously from a sustainability perspective, but modeling their plans has been severely or significantly, I'll say, affected by the onset of, or the increased onset of climate change. How does that climate model and that concern play into how you assess long-term sustainability?
Good question. And I think part of what we're doing here is maybe a small portion. That solution is we need to have a dialogue on climate change. And it is very important to SFI and within the standards I was referring to earlier about various objectives within the certification standards. And one is a climate smart forestry to ensure forest management activities do address climate change adaptation and mitigation measures. I do think that we need to look at definitely at the long range, as you were referring to. And if you look at a forest, let's say an SFI certified forest, you have to make sure that that's an important contribution to addressing the effects of that climate change.
We keep coming back to that link between healthy, resilient forests and the critical role they must play in our efforts to hit net zero carbon targets. But let's come back to this idea that once a tree is gone, it's gone for good. It stops giving. That's become a clarion call for anti-logging advocates. It's oftentimes supported by these dramatic photos or images of forests that have been clear cut. But it's important to hear Lacey Rose's perspective to give us real context when we talk about forest harvesting.
I think something that's really mind-blowing when you can get the message out there is that less than 1% of Canada's forest is harvested every year. And the reason that it's so low is because we do long-term modeling, making sure that the actions we're taking today are not going to have a negative impact on the forest of tomorrow, so that all future generations can derive the same benefits as we are today. That means being able to enjoy an old growth forest, and it means that you'll be able to have the same amount of wood products available in the future, and all of the other things that exist today will still be there 150 years plus from now.
So we've learned that less than 1% of Canada's forest is harvested every year.
We've learned that organizations like SFI ensure our forests are developed and managed sustainably.
The best way to save forests is to manage them sustainably, because humans are here. We need wood. We are having an impact on the environment, and it's not a natural environment out there anymore. There's just too many humans on the planet. So that's where foresters come in, and we're responsible for making sure that we're mitigating that impact as best as possible and providing society with our only renewable natural resource, which is wood.
And we're learning that the environmental benefits of the life cycle of a forest extend well beyond the growing years of a tree. The wood products we touch and use every day continue to capture that carbon.
And we've learned that 21st century Canadian forestry management is focused on emulating nature. It's driven by evidence-based science to ensure the life cycle of our forests extend well into the 23rd century.
So in our next episode, we'll explore the number one cause of disturbance in the forest. Fires occur naturally, but they are occurring more frequently and more intensely because of climate change. So, how does a thorough forest management plan based on emulating nature account for forest fires? I'm Erin Trafford. For our producer, Becky Coles, for Dave and the rest of the Story Studio Network team, thanks for listening.
This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future. And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.